One of my oldest and best friends has spent his whole life, his whole adult life, in law enforcement. And so I love to hear the stories he tells about the crooks he deals with. And recently, he told me something that I'd never even considered before, certainly never heard before. He talked about the way that when a cop is dealing with the bad boys, I mean the real bad boys, what you gonna do when they come for you? And when they come for these bad boys, in addition to being really big, really strong, really tough, rough, mean, and perhaps high, a lot of the worst bad boys have this psychological weapon, their eyes. They glare at the cop or whoever's trying to stop them. They glare like a cobra looking at a mouse. And it's very intimidating. I mean, you ever had anybody glare at you? Anybody big? I have. I know a taste of what that's like. But it takes a really, really brave, confident cop to handle that. They glare. It also, and yet, here's the irony. My friend says that these same big bad boys, in any other environment, any other scenario other than a confrontation and an attempt at arrest. Let's say the cop happens to get in a conversation with the bad boy at a cafe or a ball game, in a checkout lane. There's something that you can almost depend on. Those same bad boys who glare at you in the eyes when they're ready to fight, in other scenarios, will not look anybody in the eye. They keep their heads down. You almost cannot get them to make eye contact. And his interpretation of that is that beneath all that meanness is a person who really feels pretty insecure and mainly inferior. Now, just a few weeks ago, I read an article by a jail chaplain who worked in the jails of Albuquerque, New Mexico for 20 years. He got to be a familiar face around this jail. All the regulars knew him. But he too noticed and talked about this same phenomenon. He said, I absolutely could not get them to look me in the eye. And he said, too, they have this terrible sense of inferiority. They keep their heads down. I cannot get them to look at me. And he said, I believe it's not only that they feel inferiority, they've got this inferiority complex, but also they really don't like themselves. They know who they are. They know what they are. And there's some self-hatred there. You ever heard the expression, the eyes are the window of the soul? Heard that? The eyes are the window of the soul. Look into a person's eyes and you can get at least a hunch about what's there. And that's the very reason that so many people will not let you look them in the eye. They do not want you to see what's there. And I don't just mean criminals who've done something horrible. I mean everyday citizens who simply and secretly do not like who they are. There are things about themselves they hate. They don't want you to see it. And they won't look you in the eye. And I used to be like that. I was like that for about 15 years that I know of. It started when I was in high school, probably even junior high school. And people first began to point it out to me when I was 16 or so. And from then on, I was aware of it, but I couldn't seem to do anything about it. I would try to look people in the eye, but I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand it. I didn't want them to look into me and see who was really in there. Why not? Well, different reasons. This happened during my teens and during my early 20s. During my teens, it had a lot to do with hormones and puberty and desires that I'd never had before and didn't know what to do with. And I'm hearing all these sermons and Bible lessons about how evil this stuff is, and I don't know what to do. I didn't know who to talk to, and when I tried, they'd look away. And I'm not saying I was horribly sexually immoral or that. I'm just saying I struggled. Most boys do. But because I knew I was ultimately failing, I hated what was there. And I wouldn't look anybody in the eye. Then in my 20s, as I was getting into my career, I still had trouble looking people in the eye, but for a different reason. Now, life was about, the goal in life was making it, success, proving yourself, proving you can survive and thrive in the adult world, prove to your father-in-law, I can take care of your daughter here. And I wasn't so sure I could. A lot of self-doubt, insecure about that. Couldn't look people in the eye. Here's what I know. When you hate yourself, you can't look people in the eye. You don't want them seeing what's there. Tell you what else. When you do not love yourself, when you do not like yourself, it is very, very hard to believe that anybody else loves you either. How can they? If they love me, they just don't know me. That's the way some of our minds work. And have you ever noticed that there are some people, I used to be one of them, in some ways I still am. You can tell them over and over and over, I'm proud of you, I love you, you're doing well, I support you, but those words somehow don't stick. They hear them with the ear, they process them with the brain, but the message never gets into the heart. Same thing with Bible verses. They have trouble believing words from people who say they love them. And the same way with God. His word talks over and over how much he loves us in spite of our sin. So clearly, that is the gospel. He loves us in spite of our sin. He loves us just as we are. And as the common saying goes, this is a worn-out saying, but it deserves to be repeated over and over. He loves you just like you are, and he loves you too much to let you stay that way. And yet, no matter how many times you hear that, when you don't love yourself, it doesn't move you. It doesn't touch you. It's just like hearing people say stuff to encourage it. Eyes read it, ear hears it, brain processes it, but that's as far as it goes. The heart does not feel it. Why? 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 It's because when you don't love yourself, you don't know what love is. So for anybody, God or your mama, to tell you they love you, what is that? Here's an illustration. Suppose you really, really want me to go with you to a party tonight. It's at your house. You say, I want you to come. I don't know where you live. People who don't love themselves are uncomfortable going places, whether it be a party, a home, or a church, for fear that those other people are not going to love them. They just assume they'll get rejected. And so I fumble around, I don't know where her house is. You say, okay. Well, I tell you what, just get in your car and follow me. That's easy enough, right? You just follow me. But my gas tank is empty. I can't go anywhere if my fuel tank is empty. Fuel tank is your love tank. It's the love you have within yourself for yourself. And if that tank's empty, you ain't going nowhere with anybody for any reason. The love for other people and for God, it has to start inside. Until you fill that empty place inside you with a healthy, biblical type of love, you can't love anybody else. And the Scripture bears that out. It bears it out in a number of different places, but there's one especially unique perspective on this that you find in the book of Matthew and in Leviticus. Matthew chapter 22 and Leviticus 19. You got the man of the Old Testament and the man of the New Testament. Moses in Leviticus, Jesus in Matthew, they're both saying the same thing. And I chose to put this on the screen in the New American Standard Version because the way it's translated here is not necessarily better, worse, more accurate, less accurate than the others. It's that it just so happens that the way this is worded not only gets the point across, as all the translations do. The point is, love one another. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's what you're supposed to do. It's the command of the Old Testament. It's the command of the New Testament. But here, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And let's see the Leviticus passage. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people. But, here it is again, exact words. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. What I want you to see there is that you not only have the command to love, there's this little hint, this cool little cue as to how you go about loving your neighbor as yourself. And here it is. Look at it one more time. It's actually a prediction as well as a command. You shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. Or let me say it a little different. The way you love yourself is the way you're going to love everybody else. The way you love yourself will determine how well or in what ways you're able to love other people. So, it's so important to love yourself. Because think about this now. Not all that complex, but I still want to make it plain. Suppose I follow these words verbatim. I set out and I'm going to love my neighbor as myself. I'm going to love Kenneth in the same way I love myself. Well, you know what? There was a time in my life when if I loved Kenneth the same way I loved Lance, Kenneth was in trouble. Because Kenneth was in for a load of condemnation. He was going to get a load of guilt and shame. And every time he messed up, he was going to get beat up mentally by that inner critic because I did not love myself. I was that person I described in the first part of the sermon. I'm telling you, you will love others the way you love yourself. So, where do you start? You'd think that the way you start, the place you start is, okay, all right, I am going to make myself love Irma. Armadillo. Oh, she's a hard one to love. Oh, she's a hard one. But I'm going to pull it. That doesn't work. But if I love myself, everything's different. I remember telling a lady this once in pastoral counseling. It was a lady who obviously hated herself. And this was a period in my life when I was just starting to understand this stuff, just beginning to. And I said to her, sort of what I've said to you, only a shorter version. I said, you have got to love yourself. And until you do, none of these other relationships are going to work. Not the relationships with other people, with men, with your children, or with God. And when I said, you've got to start loving yourself, she looked at me with the most bewildered expression. And I knew why. She put it into words for me, but I've been taught all my life. Don't be selfish. Put others first. Share. Be generous. Don't be selfish. You know what? She's exactly right. But here's what she did not yet understand, and what maybe you do not yet understand, but you're going to get it today. There's a world of difference between selfishness and loving yourself in the biblical sense. Very, very different. In fact, strange as this is going to sound, a lack of love for yourself may actually make you into a selfish person. You know why? Because if you don't love yourself, if you hate yourself, if you're down on yourself, then you are going to be so dissatisfied with who you are that you're going to be constantly comparing yourself to other people, seeing what they've got, their abilities, their position, their families, their relationships, their connections, their possessions, their career. You're going to see all that stuff. Maybe even their happiness. You'll see that. But you won't be able to rejoice for them or be happy for them. You will be jealous because they have what you want. And the devil will convince you that if only you had what they had, then you'd finally feel good. You'd feel good about yourself even. It's a lie. That's the way selfishness works. Also, a person who does not love themselves is constantly going to feel the need to prove themselves again and again. They're going to have this obsessive drive to be number one. Now, I'm not just talking about healthy competition. That's a good thing. I'm talking about obsessed with perfection. I'm talking about if I mess up here, I won't be able to live with myself. It's all about me winning, getting some recognition, me coming in first, because then just maybe then I won't hate myself so bad. Maybe then I'll be able to look the world in the eye. But it never happens that way. Can't be. It can't be. When I hated myself, I was painfully aware of what was wrong with me. I knew it better than anybody. And so I lived with this fear that other people were going to recognize all these things that were wrong with me. Most of the time they didn't. And it wasn't near as bad as I thought anyway. But I had that fear. But you know what was worse? When you hate yourself, you not only assume other people do. Worst part is you assume God does. We just naturally assume that whatever we're feeling about ourselves is what God feels toward us. So if I feel like a filthy, low-down worm, then that's about the way God sees me. Listen, you can't have a relationship with a father who loves you when you and the father have completely different opinions about who you are. Some people have this twisted notion that God somehow wants to hear me confess what a scumbag I am because of my sins. That somehow is going to motivate him to be more forgiving. I used to do that when I was a teenager, listening to a whole lot of fear and shame-based preaching. And I remember there was a line in the hymn book. Some of you will remember this. Could he devote that sacred head for such a worm as I? Such a worm as I. Why was that in the hymn book? Because that's the way the hymn writer saw it. And so did a whole lot of the people who sang it that way. But then, in the latest edition of that hymnal, they changed those words. They changed that line. Usually, I don't like people changing words on songs I know and love. But this is one exception. Because where in the Bible does it say you're a worm, my Lord? And it changed it. Could he devote that sacred head for such a one as I? Now that's better. That's better. You who are parents, are you going to be filled with joyful delight if your child cannot look you in the eye and says, Mama, I'm just a scummy worm? Is that going to somehow please you, impress you? I don't even have to answer that, I don't believe. But a whole lot of us feel that way. We think that way. And it's time for the truth to set us free. You need to know the truth, which is this, as the scripture says. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Those of you who've been Christians for years, let's take Jerry Inman, for example. His testimony is he was a scoundrel for years. I'm not, he'll tell it and make himself sound even worse. So I'm not picking on him in public. But of course now, those of you who know him, you know his heart for God, for ministry, and his passion for prison ministry. He loves the Lord. He loves his neighbor. And there's no judgment in what he does. There's joy. But let me ask you something. Years ago, before Jerry repented, before he was saved, when he was living that bad life, did God love him any less then than now? How does it say it in 1 John? God is love. That's who God is. That's all he can do. He is love. He loves you no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, whether you're a person who's never developed a relationship with him in the first place, you're living the way Jerry Inman used to live, only for yourself, doing whatever you had to do to get ahead, not trusting anybody because you know deep down that they couldn't trust you either. So why should you trust them? Have you noticed that many people get angry if you try to talk with them about God or the scriptures, or you invite them to church? They will actually get angry, mad, maybe even cuss. Now, what is it in them? How is it? Why is it that a person could get that riled up over a simple statement or question that has to do with God, the Bible, church? I'll tell you why. It's because their experience and their perception of Christianity, of the church, and of God is that God and his people don't like people like me. And Lord, I already don't like myself. The last thing on earth I want to do is go into their church and let those people stare at me and whisper, "What's he doing here?" When they associate you with being judgmental, when they sense that you reject them, what do you expect them to assume about God? You're his representative to them. So let me say this to you. As an individual Christian and as a church, as a congregation, the most important thing you can possibly do to become a more effective servant of Christ is not what you might expect. Most important thing is not memorizing and learning to recite the plan of salvation. The most important thing is not giving a tract to the waitress at the restaurant. While those things are good and can be very effective, but I'm telling you, those are not the main thing. And if you don't do the main thing, none of the rest matters. The main thing is you learn to love people. And if you really love them, they'll be able to tell it. And they will notice, hey, there's something different about this Christian. Maybe there's something different about that church she goes to. I think I might be able to get up the gumption to walk in there. If there are more where she came from. Learn to love other people. But that brings us back to where I started. You want to learn to love other people, you better learn to love yourself. Because you will love others the same way you love yourself. We got people in this room and all over this county who can't look others in the eye. They can't look you in the eye. And in a figurative, spiritual sense, they cannot look God in the eye. And it's because of a terrible misunderstanding. Terrible misunderstanding. That's not entirely the church's fault, but partially. Jesus put the church here on earth to be the one group that a lost, self-hating person can walk into and immediately be embraced by love. That's why he put the church here. And what a stupid, twisted, distorted tragedy it is that churches have become known, have developed the reputation of being the most critical, the most condemning group on the planet. We can't change a lot of things and a lot of other people. We can change ourselves. Start with yourself. May it spread through this church, out into the world, and they shall feel his love.